All right, so we're going to get started with exercise 209. Hopefully you guys had a good President's Weekend, enjoyed your day off. The good news about spring semester is we get this, and then in like a month and a half we get spring break, and it just kind of all works nice. It's evenly spread out as opposed to fall where we cram it all in the end and have Thanksgiving and whatever. So, spring break is the first week of April, I think. I don't know the exact dates, but I think it's the first week in April. So it's nice to have a week off once in a while, right? Anyway, today we're going to continue on. You did, by the way, you've officially crossed over a quarter of the way through the semester, so we're on to the second quarter of the semester. Today we're going to have some fun, and I would be lying if I didn't say that I enjoyed this lecture. It's a fun one to do because this is when we're going to break away from doing traditional squares and rectangles and whatever, and we're going to create fun shapes like pillows and whatever. And so I'm going to show you a variety of ways of how to go about making pillows. But one of the things that's important to understand about getting into making high-quality, organic-looking shapes is you kind of have to have an intuitive sense for how gravity works and how things naturally look to do it so that it feels believable. It's not, there is no gravity in Rhino. We can't say, apply gravity to this and have it work. We have to kind of observe what's happening and mimic what's happening in reality. So we're going to go through and I'll show you a variety of styles for how we're going to create this. Essentially in the simplest terms, if we had, let's say we wanted to create a seat cushion, I could start with something like a square. And so let's say I wanted it to be 24 inches by 24 inches. And I wanted it to be, I don't know, 6 inches thick. I could end up with this loose shape that represents a seat cushion, for example. And then I could say, OK, let me fillet my surfaces, and we'll do a radius of 1. And I could say, let's make that and that go together, and let's make this and this go together. But no matter how hard I try to make these kind of work together, it's still very controlled. It's like even, it's precise and whatever. And we need to find a way to make things that aren't precise anymore. And so to do this, we need to work with a set of control curves, and we need to start manipulating those curves. And so instead of starting with a shape and doing a cage edit to it or whatever, we'll cover cage edits a little bit later on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a very simple polyline or rectangle. So I'll start with a rectangle. I'll start at point 0, 0, and I'll say that I want this to be 24 inches by 24 inches, like that. And so essentially what I have is I have a curve that has 4 sides to it. And if I were to explode that, I can end up with 4 individual line segments, there, 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 and there. Each of these line segments does have control points that identify it. And so if, for example, I had this line segment selected and I turned on my edit points, there's a little button for it, edit points. Notice there are 2 different points. There's a regular points on and points off, and then there's a control points on and points off. When you're dealing with just curves, this option here, the edit points, is a better option. And in this case, I have a straight line, and I have 2 points there and there that define that straight line. It's pretty hard to make a straight line feel organic. We need to find a way to have more control points on it. So I'm going to take this curve, and I'm going to rebuild this curve. And when I rebuild it, I get this little rebuild dialog box. And the rebuild dialog box tells me what my current point count is in parentheses. So I have currently a 2-point curve. And I have a degree on that curve of 1, which essentially means it's a straight line. A 2-degree curve would mean that it has curve in x and y, but nothing in z. And a 3D curve would be x, y, and z, essentially. When I choose to rebuild it, I want to change my point count. And so let's say instead of 2 points, 7 might be a bit much. Let's do 5. And my degree will set to be 3. And I'll go ahead and say OK. It will tell you the maximum deviation as you rebuild it as some value. Essentially, if we had a complicated curve and we rebuilt it, it would smooth out the curve or increase the complexity of the curve depending on how many control points we added to it. And this number is how different it's going to be. Essentially, it's not very different, so we're not going to worry about it. So I'll go ahead and say OK. And when I say OK, when I turn my edit points back on, you see that instead of the point at the end and at this end, I gained a few points along the way. What I can do with those points is I can start to manipulate those points a bit. So for example, I could take this point and I could make it come out a little bit, something like that. And I could make this point go in a little bit. And at some point, I can create what feels like a fairly natural curve here. I'm going to continue on a little bit. And actually, let me step back for a second. And before I rebuild those curves, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to round off these corners a bit because they are really sharp. So let me do a regular fillet. And we'll do a radius maybe of a ½ inch. And I'll round off that corner. If we wanted to see this, we could probably see it a little bit better in the top view there. There to there. There to there. And ultimately there to there. So now I have these on all the corners. But I have right here a line and then a curve and another line. If I'm creating this, it would be helpful to have the division happen right at the corner of this circle. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a line basically across this shape. So let's get my midpoint to midpoint there. And let's do my midpoint to midpoint there. And now I could split these little pieces. Let me select each of those. Split with these two as my cutting objects. And I'd have that half, which would be part of this line. And we could go ahead and join those together. And then the same thing for these lines here. So let's take this and this and this and join. And those plus that, join. And those plus that, and join. And then we can go ahead and delete those two curves there. So essentially what I have is I have curves that meet in the corner, but they've been rounded off. Let me take this set of curves, and I'm going to copy it so that I have a second set vertically up above. So if I did copy, notice that one of my options under copy is V for vertical. I want it to be vertical, and I did 6 inches last time. Let's do 6 inches again. And there's my second copy. So we've done lofts before, and certainly I could take this, and I could loft that together, for example. And essentially, I'd end up with the same thing, very rectilinear. So we need to break that down before we do any lofting or anything. So let's concentrate just for a second on the top surface. I'm going to select all of my curves here. Oops. That was supposed to be joined here. I probably mistyped join. All right, so let me take this, and this, and this, and this, and I'm going to turn those edit points on. So we see that I have a point in the middle. I have some points there at the ends, like that. I'm going to go ahead and rebuild those before I do this. So let me select them all again. 3, 4, rebuild. And we'll do a point count of 5 with a degree of 3. I'll go ahead and say OK. And it got a little bit sharper at the corners because I rebuilt the whole polycurve. So let me change and rebuild one more time. This time, let's do it with maybe 10. It's all about finding the right number of curves. We'll go with it for right now, even though it's not as rounded as I'd like. OK, once I have it like that, we'll turn my edit points on, which gives me my control points, exactly what I want. I can actually tweak these a little bit later. I'll show you that. And now I'm going to take these, and I'm going to roughen up the edges a little bit. So let's take a few of these points. Let's say maybe that and that. Let's take that. And let's just push these out a little bit. That might be a little bit much. So it may be helpful to do this in the top view. Let me take these three, actually. Let's go there. And this is where observation in real life can be helpful, because if you've looked at a cushion and you think about where the depressions occur as you sit on it and what part might be squished out and pulled in, you can kind of adjust these curves to match up with how you think a particular cushion would look. And the better results have always had a little bit more time taken in the observation process. Let's move that out a little bit. If you're uncomfortable with the drag tools, you can turn on the gumball. I'm not a huge fan of the gumball. I use it for texture mapping and that's it. But some people like to use this to have a little bit finer control over what they're doing. And you can use those to adjust these kinds of things. It's just a matter of what feels right to you. Let's push this one. Let's pull these back in a little bit, like that. And remember, there's not really a right or a wrong answer. You're just doing what feels right to you. When I work on these corners, I want to make sure that I'm working on both points. There's actually 2 points on top of each other there, so I could work on one independent of the other. I want these to stay together long term. So let me take those two, let me pull those in, and I'm essentially remaking that rounded curve there. Do the same thing here. Pull that in a little bit. Pull this one in a little bit more. And like I said, it may be helpful to look at these in the top view. You have to determine which view looks best for you. So I've roughed up the curve there, but I've done nothing. It's perfectly flat still. So now I want to think about it in its z direction. And so maybe I'll take a few of these, and I'm going to move them down. Sometimes it's easier to do those in the side view. And so in that case, I did a terrible job at it. Let's try over here. Come on, something like that. Well, so those aren't playing nice either. Let me go ahead and just move V for vertical, and we'll drop those down a little bit. Let's move these guys here. Move V for vertical. We can go up just a bit. Take these. And we're going to move V for vertical. We'll drop them down just a little bit. And let's drop these, V for vertical, up just a little bit. So as we start to look at this curve, it's no longer a straight rectilinear curve anymore. It's starting to denature a bit. Now, when we look at something like this, ultimately we're going to want to be able to create a surface that works with these contours. And we're going to do that using a command called a network surface, or a curve network. And the curve network takes a series of curves and interprets a surface through those particular curves. It needs curves fundamentally in 2 directions. So you always have to think when you're doing a curve network of which direction. So in this case, I have a curve in this direction. I have a curve in this direction. And then I have one in this direction and one in this direction. So this is, let's call this the x direction. These 2 curves would be in the y direction. This is a terrible marker. And it can then interpret a surface that would fit between those curves. And so I'm going to do it for you so you can see it. But it's really critical that we have curves. And it doesn't have to be exactly x or y. We're just talking approximates. So I have one curve in this direction. There's the second curve. And then these 2 are in the opposite direction. So I'll take these 2. I can actually select them all. And I'm going to go up to Surface, Curve Network. The type-in command for this is network surface. So it's one of the few things that doesn't match with its name. So I'll select Curve Network. If I did it correctly, I'll get an A, B, C, and D of my sides, and I'll get this dialog box. And it's going to ask me for edge curves and interior curves. All of the defaults here are just fine. I'll go ahead and say OK. And the resulting surface is kind of wavy and interprets those adjustments that I made. Now, in reality, this is close to creating kind of a natural looking surface, but I need a little bit more. So let me go ahead and delete that surface for a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an additional curve through the center of this shape. So let's do a polyline. And I'll go from the midpoint there to the midpoint, I hope, on this side. turn off a few other things here. There's midpoint. Then I'm going to rebuild that curve. So I'll rebuild, and this time we're only going to do 5. I'll say OK. Then I'm going to turn my edit points on, and so now I have some flexibility here. So let's take this and let's move it vertically. This is going to be like the depression when you're sitting in it, right? It's a flat cushion. There's your butt depression. We'll drop this one just a little bit as well. Move, vertical. Drop that down just a little bit. So now we have another profile that's helping define what this cushion is going to look like. Furthermore, if we were sitting here, there'd probably be some depressions for where my legs would go. So I'm going to create an additional curve. And this time, I don't have a midpoint to snap to. I want it to be a little bit further here. But I have to make sure that my curve goes specifically from this curve to that curve. If it overlaps or is a little short, the curve network won't work. So I'm going to make sure I turn on near, which I rarely use, but in this case, it's a perfect thing. And I'm going to go near from there straight across to there. Maybe perpendicular would be useful here so that we get it relatively close, something like that. Then I'm going to rebuild this with, let's do 7 this time. And I'll say OK. Then we'll turn our points on. There's our points. I'm going to drop this point and that point down. So move, vertical. We'll drop those down for our little leg depressions. And maybe we'll drop these up. Move, vertical. Maybe up just a little bit. And we're starting to get that secondary curve. Now we have one other fundamental problem. And that is when I try to make the curve network, those two curves don't match. So how can Rhino make a surface that goes through those two curves? So I have to make sure, I'm going to turn on my edit points again, that this point here is on that curve so that those two intersect. So I'm going to move, and I'm going to use my good old perpendicular snap to make sure that those two snap to one another and intersect at that point. OK, so now I have these curves that are starting to define the surface. So I'm going to select these curves again. And I'm going to go back to Surface, Curve Network, A, B, C, and D. All of my options are fine. And now my cushion is starting to live with a little bit of a depression for where I would be sitting in it. Does that make sense for how I'm going about it? So it takes observation to see what it would look like. So let's take this a step further and start to make this into the rest of the cushion. So let's just, I'm going to hide this upper surface for just a second. And I'm going to rebuild this one. So we'll take these, rebuild, do it by 10. All right. Oh, wait, these weren't joined together. Hold on. All right, let me rebuild those again. Rebuild. 10, there we go. And then we're going to turn those control points on. Same thing, I'm going to make a few modifications to this. So we'll take a few of these.
Where'd you go for the control points?
The control points is right here.
The bottom?
Sorry, it's slightly off on the screen. It's right there. It's a line with 2 little squares on it. It's called edit points. All right, so let me continue. Let's move this in a little bit like that. Let's move this one in a little bit like that. Those are a little too far. Let's move these. So, you know, working in the top view might be helpful. Push those out just a little bit. Too far. Push this out just a little bit. And essentially, we're trying to make the curtain or the cushion just a little bit lumpy. Right. Unfortunately, my near snap keeps screwing me up, so I'm going to turn that off. Go like that. A couple more adjustments. There. And there. Something like that. That works. Likewise, if I wanted to adjust the height, now would be the time to adjust the height a little bit. This is the cushion that's at the bottom, so I'm not overly concerned with it in terms of height because it's going to sit on the ground anyway, or on a chair or whatever. Maybe a few little adjustments here. Move vertical, you know, just by a little bit there. Let's move vertical a little bit here. Vertical. Just so that there's a little variety. Move vertical. There. All right, something like that. Let me show everything. So I'm back to where I have these surfaces. And now I can make that curve network with the 4 curves at the bottom. So I'll select those 4 curves. I'll go up to Surface, Curve Network, and I'll go ahead and make the bottom of that, which is, you know, more flat than the top because it's not where the depression would happen. But now I need to make the sides of this particular shape. So let's go ahead and draw a line down from corner to corner. So I'll go from there to right there. Notice that I'm snapping so that those points are for sure on top of each other. And we could go from there to there. There to there. And there to there. Now part of adding the realism to this shape is instead of having just a straight line, it would be really nice if these bowed out a little bit. So let me rebuild all 3 of those, or all 4 of these. Rebuild. And for complexity's sake, I'm only going to rebuild by 3. And when I turn my edit points on, it's going to give me just these 2 little control points there and there. Then I'll take these, and this you really kind of have to do in the top view. As you go to move them, you want to have them stick out almost perpendicular. And so you can see there, see how it's bowing out? It's hard to do this in the perspective view because they have a tendency to move in X and Y and they won't look right. So do them in kind of combination. There's those 2. Pull them out just a little bit like that. Take those 2. And that definitely wasn't what I wanted to do. That. Last 2. Put them out like that. So now I can use the top curve here, the bottom curve here, this and that, and essentially there's another curve network for me. So I'll go back up to Surface, Curve Network, OK, and I now created the front of my cushion. And so we can decide, is it working? Do I have the right flex or not? And we can make adjustments and evolve that. Furthermore, on something like the side, or the back is probably a good example, we've got somebody's butt depression here, and we need it to kind of bulge out because the stuffing had to go somewhere. So let me draw one more, and we'll go from there down to here, perpendicular. And let's rebuild that. Oops, rebuild. Let me turn my points on. There we go. We'll take this, and we're going to move them so that they stick out a lot more to compensate for that. And then we can take these 3 plus the top and the bottom, and we can do a curve network. Okay. And suddenly we've created the backside with the bulge for where the stuffing went. You guys see how I'm working through this? And so we'll do the same thing. You guys don't have to watch me create too many more curves, I promise. And we'll take this curve, this, and that. And we'll do another network surface. And we'll do another set over here. 2, 3, and 4. All right. And so I was able to create a cushion that feels more authentic than the traditional cushion would be. Now I can take this a step further, and I could actually put a little bit of maybe piping along the edges or whatever. You have to think about how it would be stitched together if you were making the cushion to begin with. So let me take a little circle here. I'm going to go right to the corner, and let's do a diameter of, oh, I don't know, 3/16. Oops, can't 3/16. There it is. Let me rotate 3D. And in this sense, I want my rotation angle to be kind of going out at 45 degrees-ish, something like that. I'm going to have to do this in 2 operations. Let me rotate. Rotate 3D. Try that one more time. It's snapping on me. That's the problem. Stop snapping on me. There. There. All right. And so now I can work this so that it's up as a cross-section curve like that. And I can then use this as a sweep. So I can sweep one. There's my rail. There's my cross-sectional curve. And I can essentially create the piping that would go along the edge of that cushion. So we can do the same thing going the opposite direction. Let's sweep one. There's that curve. There's that cross-section curve. And we can hit OK and OK. And it's important to keep that approximately at 45 as we go around. As I continue, when I get to this end, I'm going to duplicate the edge of that curve to get myself the circle. And then we'll continue with the sweep one. There. There's my cross-section curve. And we can continue on with the little piping that goes on that end. And then we have to do a little bit more to continue here. The risk is that your curve gets off a little bit and you have a weird intersection somewhere that you're going to have to manually resolve. It does happen. So let me duplicate this edge there, and we'll sweep that. There's my rail. There's my curve. And there's the balance of the piping going there. And they came together reasonably OK. Right? They're not quite perfect. We may need to do some modifications, although if we render it from back here, especially on that side, you'd never see it, so I'm not overly worried about it. So you have to weigh how much value there is for making it perfect. So I could do the same thing. I could add the little piping around the bottom or whatever. At some point then, I have to actually apply the material. So don't forget about materials. So I'll go in and I'll load a material. And on my flash drive here, I should have some fabric materials. There we go. And depending on what you're after, there's different things. So I have leathers. Sometimes there's some really ugly ones, but you can pick which one works best for you. Let's do the blue flower. It's pretty ugly. There it is. Right? Maybe not if we were in Hawaii, but such is life. It's not spring break just yet. So let me go ahead and apply that material to all of these objects. I could do it by layer or I could do it by object. In this case, I'll just do it by, I don't have layers set up, so I'll do it by object. Apply material to selection. And then let's go ahead and look at this in rendered view. And so we want to try to take a look. Obviously, we need it to be consistent across all of it. So let's take the first piece here. Actually, let's take everything and let's apply box map to it. So we'll go to texture mapping. Apply box map. It's relatively a box, so we'll go with that. So we'll do a bounding box, world. It's capped, yes. And then x equals y equals z, so at least we're consistent in our fabric. So it could theoretically be a little bit better if I spent time to think about how the fabric lined up, but you get the idea that I'm working through this. We may also find that the repeat here, maybe the fabric's a little big. Let's try 2.0. And now we can be looking at it with more of the little flowers on it, or something like that. You can pick a different material, but you guys are getting what I'm after, certainly. OK, so I now have this established. I like it. The other option, if we didn't like the box mapping, would be to apply a surface mapping to the individuals. So I could take something like this, and I could apply a surface mapping to it. And then I could adjust the scale of it. The problem here is that it's much harder to necessarily get the scales to match up. So this one, again, would have to have a surface mapping to it there, and it probably needs to be a little bit finer there. Something like that is pretty good. This one could have a surface mapping, and notice I'm doing each one of these as a separate surface map because they're all different surfaces. So we could say 2.0 there. Oops, I didn't lock them. Something like that. And sometimes this will be necessary depending on the depressions and kind of how it's done. Okay? So that was essentially creating a non-organic type object. I want to continue this and talk about several other types because this is just one strategy of getting there as reinforcement for this concept. So there's my first one. Let's go ahead and I'm going to switch layers and we'll turn that first one off and I'm going to build another example. So again, I'll start with a rectangle, and this time I'm going to do more of a throw pillow style. And so let's say that this one's smaller and it's maybe 16 by 16, something like that. I'm going to go ahead and rebuild just as I did before. Sorry, let me explode it first. And then I'll rebuild. And we'll say maybe 5. I'll turn my edit points on. And I'm going to round over the corners just a little bit on this. Like that. OK. And then this time, I'm going to go diagonally across there. And I'll take this surface, and I'm going to rebuild that by 5. I'll turn those points on. And now I'm going to move these vertically. So I'll go to move, vertical, and then I'll go up maybe like that. Let's take this one and move vertical even a little bit higher. Maybe something like that. We'll do the same thing with another cross-sectional curve going this way. So we'll go there, from there to there, rebuild. Turn my points on. Remember, this point has to match to, it has to intersect with that curve on the top. Let's take these, and I'll move vertically, maybe like that. So you guys can see the shape that I'm going after here. But if I took this and I said, oh, great, I have the shape. Let me go ahead and network surface it. I get this. It says, wait a minute, I can't sort the curves. And so remember back when I was first talking about the network surface, we have to be very specific about curves going in one direction and curves going in the other direction. And if we look at this, we have a curve here, and we have a curve here. And so those are definitely going in x and y. And then we have these other kind of 45-degree curves. So how do we know which way? And so all that's important is that we keep consistency about which direction the curves are. So we have a curve in this direction, and we have a curve in this direction. If I took this curve and joined it to this curve, that's going in the same direction, roughly, as that curve. So I'll take this and join them together. And that's going roughly in this 45-degree direction. This and this, if I join them, are going roughly in that same 45-degree direction. And this one is the opposite. So now I can take these and go to Surface, Curve Network. Something didn't join correctly. I have a tendency to type join with the O and the I backwards. So there we go. So we'll take those, network surface, and suddenly it can recognize it, and we can move forward. So I'll go ahead and say OK. And we can see now, let me switch back into shaded mode here, that we have essentially half the pillow. Given how I did the curve on the bottom, this is as simple as mirroring it. Like that, and we can have the other half of the throw pillow. I could take this a step further maybe to add some realism to it. Maybe I'll add a little button or something that goes on it. Do an ellipsoid. a second. Let me start here. Here. I'm going to make it down on the flat so that it's not. So let's say this is 1 inch. There. And let's say this is also 1 inch. And then let's look at this in its side view and say maybe 1/4 inch, something like that. It's like a little button. And let's move this so that it's up there. Oops, I wasn't quite in the center. Move, let me turn on center snap. There we go. And we can move it like that. And we can create a little tiny button that goes on the pillow. You guys get the idea of the kinds of things that I'm doing here. So we could, by varying the curves that made this up, of course we could dent the pillow. You know, sometimes you see on the TV shows and whatever that they have, people like to put the dent in the crease. You could do the same kinds of things, you just vary the curves. If you wanted there to be more of a dent in the curve, we could turn the points on. We could take this and push it in a bit more so we'd have a dent in the top of it. This is exaggerated a little bit, right? And we could take this and this and this, network surface, and you'd end up with a little dent in the top. You guys get the idea. So it's all about observation of what's actually happening, and you're trying to mimic it. So let's do something else that people tend to like. Sometimes people want to do a curtain, right? Have drapes hanging or something along those lines. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a polyline. And let's say that polyline, I'll make it 4 feet. Oops, let me make it straight. 4 feet. Turn on ortho here, something like that. And I'll hit enter. Then I'll take this and I'm going to rebuild it. Let's do it maybe 10. And then I'll turn my points on, and I end up with a bunch of individual points. I'm going to leave the starting point and the ending point in the same place, but then I will select opposite curves. So let's take this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and I'll move them in this direction. And then we'll take these there, and we'll move them in that direction. So you can see I'm starting to build the curves here. Let's take this whole curtain, and I'm going to copy it. We're going to go V for vertical, and we'll go up, I don't know, maybe 84 inches. There it is. And so on its most simple level, right, we could take these two, and we could loft them together, and we'd end up with the very straight, not so exciting curtain. But if we took a little bit of time and we started to tweak this a little bit, let's say we wanted to do, I don't know, a billowing curtain or something like that. We could take the bottom curve here. We could do our points, sorry, turn our edit points on. I could take these. I could move them back or even out a little bit. We could take these points. Move this out. And we could work to create, and this, you may have to do this in the top view for clarity purposes here. You can work to create the billowing effect at the bottom of the curtain. So something like that is probably pretty good, except that I need to adjust that out a little bit more. Something like that at the bottom. And when we jump back, let me go ahead and create a curve that's there, a curve that's here, and I'm going to create one in the center. So let me go midpoint to midpoint here, and let me do, yeah, that'll work. Let me do points, let me rebuild it, and I don't need 10, I need about 4. Let me turn those points on. There we go. And let's make this and this come out a bit. Something like that. And we could then do our curve network here. So curve, the surface, curve network. OK. And we start with it there, but then we've created the bulge of the wind blowing it. So that kind of makes sense how I'm evolving it and thinking through it. The truth is that this side probably wouldn't be fixed. So let's take it a step further. I'm going to delete that for a second. Let's take this, and let me turn back on my points here. And let's move these so that they're more fluttering. As part of this. And you can spend more time kind of working through the details of how this is really going to work. Turn this back on. Yeah, maybe it's something like that. And then we'll take and connect from here to here. Points on. Oh, sorry, I have to rebuild this first. Rebuild. There we go. My edit points on, and then we'll adjust this back a little bit too. Let's move this, that. Let's move this about like that. And then we can do a network surface of this as well. So surface, curved network, OK. And you can see that we're starting to create that billowing curtain. So it's an evolution of similar stuff. If we wanted one side to get shorter than the other, we could just scale the curtain if we wanted it to get compressed. So let me take this, let me copy it, and we'll do the other half of the curtain. Copy, vertical, negative 84 inches. There it is. And this time, let's take this piece. So let's scale 1D. From there, let's make it a little bit shorter, something like that. Let's copy this, vertical. Oops. Copy, vertical. Let's go up like 4 feet, 48. Something like that. Let's scale 1D a little bit more, and we could make that drop back even tighter. And then this is going to start to swoop down and over. So I'll do another curve that goes from here to there to there. Let's rebuild that a few more times. Rebuild 5. Now, obviously, as part of this, I've had a lot of practice in how to do this. I've done it many times. I know kind of what looks right. It's going to take you a while to work your way through setting this up and having it work nicely for you. It's OK. Take your time, and you'll get there, and you'll start to see how stuff evolves. Right? So in that case, this has almost a little bit of a tie back, where those are being tied back to here. Maybe that needs to be a little bit less, and it's a different look for the curtain. If you wanted to, let's say, make a curtain rod that went through all of it, I'll show you one more thing, and then I promise I'll shut up and you guys can do stuff. Okay? I told you I have fun with this one. Right? So let's say that I wanted to create a curtain rod that went through this window. I could say, let's create a straight line that went through the curtains here. And scale 1D. I should have done a little longer here. Let's go like that. Something like that. Let's move it, move vertically so that it's down, so that it would go through the top part of those curtains. Let me go ahead and create a circle on the end.
Can you apply these drawings in real life?
Can I what?
Can you, like, on the software, can you apply that in real life?
Can I apply it in real life? I don't.
If you want to design, let's say that cushion that you made,
Uh-huh.
you want to make, you know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the part of the reason we're covering this today is so that you guys are doing your table and chair, and a lot of times you want to do it. Oh, could you actually make it, like have it 3D printed or something?
Yeah. From Rhino?
You could, depending on the surface, you might be able to unroll parts of the surface and then cut out the fabric to sew together. You know, if the 3D printer was big enough and or printed soft enough materials, you could theoretically do it that way. Usually there's not quite as direct of a translation. It's more for the graphics and the rendering than anything else. It's for show, for the most part. So let me do a diameter, I don't know, 1.5 inches, something like that. So there's my little hole. I want to punch that through the curtains to create the rings. So let me, in the right view, I'm going to do a project command through this surface and that surface. And remember, the project command throws the circles out for what I'm going to cut through. It's good on some of it, but like that one's not going to work for me. Let me hold on a second. Move this a little tighter to the top. And let's move this. Center to there. Project. Let's take a look. Yeah, there we go. So I get all those little circles. Let's use those as trims. And we'll go through. Come on. There we go. And now I have the little holes that go through the top. I would need a little curtain rod so we can do a sweep. Let's do this a little bit smaller. Scale there. Let's just do a 0.75, a little smaller. And let me sweep one. There's my rail. There's my rod. And suddenly I have the curtain rod that goes through the curtains. You guys get how I'm evolving this. Okay? Part of the reason that I'm trying to do these sorts of things is to get you thinking about how do I create certain things and how do I go about it. Once you have the curve network command under your belt, it starts to get really easy to create these custom surfaces through a few control curves. One of the temptations with these control curves is to have too many curves. And so you saw whenever I was working, I really tried to limit myself to the border curves with one or maybe two in that direction. Even when I did the curtains, I had one curve and another curve, and I tried to be simple about that. Right? Maybe there was a third curve in here. When I shrunk it and had this one here, there was one curve that went like that. But it's still a limited number of curves. When we get to topography, we're going to start doing where we have, the grid of curves with a bunch of them and a bunch of them. This will get you into trouble if you don't have something that you're working from. Like a piece of topography, it works because we can make sure that they intersect each other. But something like this, really stick with simple curves. I would say no more than 6 as you start to evolve. So what I'd like you to do is to try to create 2 objects that are organic in shape. You can, of course, design something that relates to your table and chair. You do not have to do something related to your table and chair, nor do you have to have this kind of object as part of your table and chair. Some people want to have it, in which case it becomes relevant and something that you want to include. It's a personal thing. But I do want you to spend some time thinking through how do I create these kinds of objects, because thus far everything we've created has been very precise. And so we have to get practice in the non-precise things. All right? Are there any questions? Yeah?
Is there a way to put a point on the curve network surface and drag that?
So once you've created, this is a great question. Once you've created the surface itself, it is independent of the curves that you use to create it. So if I look at this surface, for example, and I wanted to work with that surface afterward, I can use the button next door, which is just points on, and it will give me individual control points that represent that surface. Generally, it's a lot of control points. But I could take a group of those control points, something like that, and sometimes the gumball works better for this, and I could adjust those, and it's going to adjust the surface accordingly. And so in this case, there's so many that it's kind of difficult to deal with, and you may be better going back and working with the control curve and recreating the surface rather than trying to edit the points. It's just a matter of the complexity of the surface. I could also take the surface itself. I could rebuild the surface, and you see that right now it has a lot of control points, and I could say, no, I just want 5. And it will simplify. Obviously, it got rid of some of the curves and stuff. But in this instance, if I were to turn my points on, there's far fewer points, and so I can see more immediate results on the surface itself because there's fewer points to work from. But I've lost the waves that were happening because I've simplified the surface and I've smoothed it out. So it's just different ways of manipulating the surface. Another question? OK, it's probably because you don't have true x and y. And I'll come and sit with you, and we'll sort it out. OK? Any other global questions? No? Remember, I've been doing this a really long time, so I make it look easy. It's not that easy. And it will take you all day today to make like a cushion. It's OK. That's the way it should be. You need practice.
Is there a way to have like a specific curve, so like you could import like a sine function and then work off of that, or is it you just have to draw something?
No, you could if you had a curve that you did in AutoCAD or something. They don't. Rhino doesn't have like catenary curves, which are based on gravity. You know, if you had a string and you held it with 2 ends, it would be a natural gravity curve. In version 5, they don't have it. In version 6, they do. But if you created the curve, if it was a sine wave or something like that, if you created it somewhere else, you could then import that curve. Like say you did it in AutoCAD or something, you could import that curve and use that curve. So it doesn't have to be something that you drew. There are other curves that you can create in Rhino, like a spiral. For example, you can create, hold on a second, let me. Sorry, it's like a spring sort of thing. You could create something like that and work off of it. So there are other types of curves that are, like you could do a helix as another example. So there are other curves that are built into Rhino that you can, of course, use. But if you wanted a specific, like a sine, I don't think there's a sine curve. No, not in Rhino. So you'd have to create it somewhere else and then bring it in. But as long as it was an exportable format from wherever you created it, you could, of course, use it. Any other questions? No? Individual or group? Yeah. Network surface and network SRF. Sorry. I don't know why it's different than curve network, but it's a Rhino thing. Yeah.
So if you created like multiple like domes and you wanted to see like you made multiple curve networks, could you like I might have to draw it. Like if you had like a bunch of poles and you wanted to like have the curve go through the holes to make that kind of a cheese grater like so there would be openings. I guess because there wouldn't be like a direction, there would be kind of everything is circular, so there wouldn't have a direction. You wouldn't have 2 directions to work from.
I don't. We'd have to play around with it. We can sit and try to do it. It's usually if it's complicated. Let's say it's spherical, where you're thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't really correspond. Usually you can do it in halves or quarters and put those pieces together. It just depends. If you show me what you want to try to make, I'll see what I think is the right strategy for how to make it.